Thank you so much, Tanabe-san, for the very kind introduction, and thank you so much to RIETI and to the EU-Japan Center for International Cooperation for inviting me. Let me try and share my screen. So maybe just one word about Bruegel and then about this presentation before I go through it. So Bruegel is a small think tank founded in 2004. We have about maybe 20 or so fellows, and in total we are about 50, 60 people. We're based in Brussels. It was founded on the anniversary of the 50th anniversary of the Élysée Treaty between France and Germany, where France and Germany essentially reconciled after the war and signed a cooperation treaty. And so it has a little bit of the flavor of an international organization because we have government members. So originally only EU governments could be members, and then after the United Kingdom left the EU, we changed the charter so that also the UK could stay and some other European governments could in principle join. But we're not dependent of those governments, so each government just has a very small share of the contributions, and we are also independent of the European Commission, so none of the European institutions is a member of Bruegel. Then I'd like to just give you a perspective of this presentation. So this is a variant of a presentation that I originally designed for a retreat, an internal retreat of the Director Generals of the European Commission near Brussels in April. And then this presentation has been evolving as we have done more work in this area. So I'm saying that because it is important for you to understand that I'm not particularly targeting this presentation to a Japanese audience or to an international audience. It's the same presentation I would give in Brussels. There is also a particular emphasis of this presentation on the most recent and, in my view, weakest part of the EU response to the Inflation Reduction Act, which is a thing called the Net Zero Industry Act, which deals mostly with the domestic dimension of the EU response. I will say something about the international dimension as well, but this does not come out as clearly in this presentation as maybe I should have done it for a Japanese audience. But thank God we have an excellent discussion, Tamura-san, and so I think he will bring some of this up, and then we can have a discussion about what is missing here. So let me start by reminding you of the philosophy of EU economic policy making. And so by EU economic policy making, I mean within the European Union, but I mainly mean at the level of the European Commission and of European institutions, so at the EU level. So we have in Europe, of course, a market-based model where traditionally state intervention had to be justified in fairly narrow terms, right? So this is a model that evolved in some countries immediately after the war. That's true for Germany. In other countries, it took longer, but I think this is something that everyone converged on, I think, in the 70s and 80s, and that was enshrined in the Lisbon Treaty, which is the current main treaty that defines the competencies of the European Commission, the duties of member states, and generally the functioning of the European Union. There is a very strong precept in that treaty, a very strong assumption that competition within the EU is good for efficiency and growth, and that there is no trade-off between competition and external competitiveness. So this is an important point because historically, some countries in Europe, and of course the most extreme cases where Germany and Italy in the interwar period have taken the view that in order to be strong and competitive in international markets, it would be good not to have too much competition inside the country, right? So in particular that national champions are important to compete in international markets. And so this is a philosophy that is very much contrary to the philosophy of the European Treaty, where there is no trade-off between competition and external competitiveness. So we try through the treaty to make sure that there's a strong competition function inside the EU. And one of the reasons for that is that if we did not try, then it would be harder to have a single market where all firms can compete and participate regardless of the country in which they are based. So if we did not have these strong competition rules, then countries could support their own firms at the expense of other firms within the EU. But that, of course, would deviate from the idea that as far as the economic relations within the EU are concerned, we want to make it look as much like a single market as possible. There's also a long-held assumption that international trade and multilateral trade rules protecting trade are good for the EU. So the EU has been a strong supporter of the multilateral trading system and of the WTO. We have, for most of our history, taken the view that growth and development among EU trading partners, so these would be countries like Japan and the United States, but also developing countries and emerging markets, including China, that growth and development of all these countries is good for the EU. And finally, there is a peculiarity, a set of special circumstances that have to do with the competencies of the European Union, of the European Union institutions, such as the European Commission, relative to the member state competencies, which imply that the European Commission and the EU level is a strong regulator. So we can pass laws at the EU level, which must be respected in all member countries, which supersede national laws, but we do not have a strong fiscal function at the EU level. And so we cannot provide public goods. We cannot have large amounts of spending. We cannot have redistribution. So all important spending items are member state competency. There is an EU budget. We have some innovation support at the EU level. We have some regional support. So support that increases cohesion within the EU, but most important spending functions are national, and the EU budget is tiny compared to national budgets. It's something in the order of, I think, 1.5% of EU GDP, whereas federal states typically have budgets anywhere between 10 and 20% of their GDPs. So this is our starting point. Okay, now we are, with this model in mind, you have to understand the challenges that the EU is facing. And so I would say there are three that we are trying to deal with at once. And this now reflects, in a sense, what is new over the last 3 or 4 years. So the first most important challenge, of course, is decarbonization. And this is a little bit of a challenge to the traditional model, because in the traditional model, industrial policy would typically take the form of improving framework conditions for all firms, so-called horizontal industrial policy, rather than promoting specific sectors or specific firms. However, there is a literature, an economic literature on decarbonization that argues that innovation creates what they call path dependencies, which means that if you are very good in one area of innovation, then you're more likely to discover new things as a firm in a related area. And so if you are trying to bias technological change in the direction of developing clean tech technologies, so technologies can help us with decarbonization, it may make sense to promote a specific type of innovation, not just innovation more generally. And that would not be part of the standard model that we have operated with. A new challenge, a second challenge, is the objective of economic security. So this is a term that people have started using a lot in the last year or two. And so the trigger for this concern in part has to do with growing concerns about China in the last few years. I think it's probably fair to say that of the three economic areas that cooperate closely, Japan, the United States, and the EU was the last to wake up to the potential threats from China. Japan was the first, I think, then the US, and now us. But the other fact that really triggered this concern about economic security was the experience with getting a cutoff from Russian gas. So the idea that if we are too dependent in our imports on a country that is potentially hostile, this can have very bad consequences. Of course, I should remind you that this experience, in a sense, cuts both ways, because we were hugely dependent on Russian gas, and yet once the cutoff happened, the consequences were far less bad than what many had feared. So there are two lessons there. One should not be complacent that dependency can be abused. So Japan had this experience much earlier than we did. I believe that China cut or tried to cut off Japan from the supply of some critical raw materials over 10 years ago. We had this experience much more recently with Russia, but in both cases, we managed to substitute away from materials that were cut off. So this is also something to bear in mind. And then the third, and you know, possibly most relevant experience to the policy reaction that I want to talk to you about is economic nationalism in advanced competitor countries. And so this is something that we became aware of in the European Union through Donald Trump. But the general view in Europe is that the economic nationalism of Trump was to some extent continued by the Biden administration, even though the Biden administration is much more internationalist minded, much friendlier to Europe and possibly Japan than it was the case for the Trump administration. Still, some of the economic policies of the Trump administration were maintained, particularly in the trade area. And then, of course, we had the Inflation Reduction Act, which is, you know, an attempt to introduce industrial policies that discriminate against foreign producers directly or indirectly. Another source of this concern with economic nationalism is, again, China. So in this case, it's not about China as a country that could abuse its trade relations with the EU by cutting us off from certain supplies if geopolitical conditions worsen. In this case, it's a concern about China as a country that aggressively subsidizes its industry, that is trying to overtake ours and then put us out of business. Now, I'm going to spend a minute talking about this concept of economic nationalism. Remember, this is a presentation I've made for European audience where this is less familiar. It may be more familiar to you because Japan had a phase in the 50s and 60s where it used a similar approach, and I think quite successfully. But let me try to do one conceptual clarification, and the clarification is important because sometimes people confuse what I call economic nationalism just with state intervention, right? Which policies where the state takes a strong role, and these are not the same things. And so I have done this little matrix to explain why they're not the same thing. So state intervention is about, or statism, it is the belief that state control of economic activity is necessary to some degree. So this is given by the horizontal axis of the matrix. So there is always some degree of control of economic activity by the state. We can go from an extreme of a completely free market. So this is the ideal of classical liberalism. It never has really existed, but it came close, perhaps in the middle of the 19th century in the UK. And then we have, complete control of economic activity by the state in planned economies, right? So this is one dimension. The thing about state control or state intervention in the economy is that it would be an issue even in a world that has just one country in it, right? So you would have to think, societies would have to think to what extent the state should be running the economy. Now, economic nationalism only becomes an issue in a world that has more than one country in it. And so this is given by the vertical axis of this matrix. And so I would define economic nationalism as a view that there is a strong trade-off, a regular trade-off between national and foreign economic interests. So this is the idea that normally policies that increase domestic prosperity necessarily or almost inevitably go to the expense of foreign prosperity of foreign countries. So the easiest example here is protectionism, right? So you're trying to essentially protect your own firms against those firms from other countries. You're trying to help your own workers and firms at the expense of foreign workers and firms. Another way to think about it is this is my country first ideology, in the same way that, for example, Donald Trump in his famous inauguration speech defined his view of the world as an America first view. So it's not just that he feels primarily responsible for America. Of course, all governments are accountable to their own citizens, and it's the welfare of their citizens that matters for them. That's not the issue, right? The issue with that speech was that he implied that America first implies that America has to promote its own welfare by taking policy actions that normally would go at the expense of other countries and firms outside the US. So there is a very interesting question, a very long literature in economics on whether economic nationalism is actually satisfied, right? So if you think back to the liberal economic tradition that started with Adam Smith in Scotland, the view there was that it's not satisfied, that essentially that the wealth of nations is pursued through open borders, international trade, and generally nations become richer together, that it's not one versus the other. But there is also a strong intellectual tradition that starts at about the same time, a little later, that says the opposite. And this intellectual tradition is mostly concerned with countries that are catching up. And so the historical background for this is the United States and Germany that were trying to develop in a world where the British Empire was by far the most developed country and imposed its own trade rules and trade preferences on the rest of the world. And so there is a very nice paper by Alexander Hamilton, who was the first Secretary of the United States Treasury, where he argues that developing manufacturing industries in the US is important. So at that point, the US was an agrarian state, and that it requires active state intervention to support American firms at the expense of British competition. There is a similar longer book by a German economist and historian, Friedrich List, that takes the same view. And then you could view the Japanese development, what was called outside Japan. I don't know whether Japanese economists use the same term, but you could view what has been called the Japanese developmental state of the 1950s and 60s as being in the same tradition. Now, this type of economic nationalism, I think, is justified. And the reason for it is, I'm not saying that it's always the optimal way of doing it, but intellectually it has a strong basis. And the reason for this is that it is a straightforward extension of the argument that you would use to justify subsidies and industrial policy in just one country. So if you have, the world is divided in two halves, one that already knows how to produce things, one that still does not know how to produce things. And if learning how to produce things requires actual production, so there's learning by doing, or if there are big barriers to entry of new firms in the half of the world that is not yet producing, then this justifies the intervention of the state to help that half of the world catch up, right? So even a social planner at the level of the entire planet would want to support only the firms in the half of the world that are catching up, not the side that is already catching up. What is a bit less clear is whether there is ever justification for economic nationalism in advanced countries. And so these are countries that already know how to produce. Should they, is it, in their own interests to impose protectionism as a way to shield themselves from foreign competition, or should they unambiguously embrace open and free trade? So most economists would say they should be open and they should trade, and it actually helps them because they can get goods imported in from areas of the world where they are much cheaper to produce, and so there's a welfare gain from them as well. But there are some arguments in the other direction. So one argument is that if you know how to do stuff and the other part of the world does not, you can sell it to them at an inflated price. So this is the protection of rents. There is also a view which is quite powerful politically, that some types of jobs, particularly manufacturing jobs, are of higher quality for the workers because they are more easily unionized, because they come with a particular sociology around them, and then defending these jobs, keeping them in the own country is a good thing. And so even though emerging markets would normally, by catching up, take those jobs, and the advanced countries would start doing services, innovation, and so forth, it's important to fight for them. So this is an argument that has been made, and certainly that is the argument behind the political economy of advanced country economic nationalism, right? This is probably the reason why Donald Trump thought that this was a good political strategy, and why Joe Biden is now to some extent imitating this. And then there's maybe a third argument, which is, I would say, the intersection of economic nationalism with national security. So this is the idea that, unless we keep a leadership role in certain technologies, the country that is catching up might start posing a threat, including in a military way. This does not justify economic nationalism across the board, but it does justify sort of a security-oriented nationalism in specific sectors. Now, even though there are, these arguments that back it, there are, of course, some problems. The very obvious one is that if you think from a global perspective, all countries are worse off if they undertake nationalist foreign economic policies, with the possible exception of temporary nationalist policies in catching up countries, like in Japan in the 1950s or 60s. So one could argue that what Japan did back then for itself was ultimately in the interests of the whole planet, because it made Japan into a country that was a sophisticated and rich producer of goods that then benefit everyone. The second main problem is that economic nationalism is vulnerable to special interests, right? So you will always get individual firms arguing that for the sake of society as a whole, they need protection. But in fact, they may be inefficient firms, and it would be better to let them go out of business. So even from a national perspective, it might not be a good idea to have these protectionist tools. And then the third and very important argument, particularly in the context of the IRA, and I know Tamura-san wants to talk about this, is that in some cases, economic nationalism and economic security could actually conflict with each other. And the reason is that establishing economic security may require an international strategy where you are supported by your allies, and even if you do not focus mainly on your allies, where you require, for example, raw material imports or intermediate imports from a very wide set of countries, of developing countries. And so if you are a rich country and you are seeing as pursuing a purely nationalist economic policy, it's going to be much harder to convince the rest of the world to be on your side and to trade with you on fair terms, right? So in that sense, economic nationalism could actually backfire from a security perspective. So forgive me for this long excursion. Let me now get right into the practical side. So how has the EU actually responded to the economic nationalism of the Inflation Reduction Act and the broader context of the perceived threat from China and the experience with Russia after the invasion of Ukraine? Well, there have been three policy instruments. Two of them are legislative proposals. So these are laws at the EU level that the European Commission has sent to the European Parliament, but which have not yet been passed. They're still being reviewed. I'm sure Commissioner Breton talked about them, because two of these, the two main ones, the Net Zero Industry Act and the Critical Raw Materials Act, come from his shop. So the Director Generals that he is responsible for drafted these. And then we have a thing called the Temporary Crisis and Transition Framework for State Aid, TCTF, which is not a law, but it's a communication from the Commission where it explains to member states how it intends to implement state aid following the IRA and the invasion of Ukraine. And so let me summarize sort of the broad philosophy of all three of these packages. So both the Net Zero Industry Act and the Critical Raw Materials Act, and to some extent also the state aid framework, they focus on specific technologies and raw materials. So they pick certain economic activities that they view are more important than others. They come up with lists of what is worth promoting. So in that sense, they're very similar to the IRA that also comes up with lists of technologies that are worth promoting. It then, in a second step, both the NZIA and the Critical Raw Materials Acts set reshoring or self-sufficiency objectives with respect to these technologies. So this is something the IRA does not do, right? The IRA does not have a target that 40% of all clean technology should be produced that is consumed in the United States should also be produced in the United States. But these two acts have such a self-sufficiency target. Now, it is a soft target, right? So Commissioner Breton probably would say, if asked, well, this is aspirational, we think that it's important to have these objectives in mind, but of course, it's not going to be a violation of the law if we don't exactly hit it. There is also a diversification target in the Critical Raw Materials Act. So the Critical Raw Materials Act says that we will try and promote our own raw material value added and extraction such that we have a maximum of 65% dependency on any single country, and the rest should be other countries. And so this is not necessarily then the rest doesn't mean you have to produce this locally, but it has to be produced somewhere else outside that single country. But this is only in the CRMA. So the Net Zero Industry Act only has this self-sufficiency target. The third step then of this legislation is to ask member states of the EU to support projects that advance these objectives. And for those, there are some policy instruments. And the main one is actually the acceleration of permitting. So these are administrative procedures that are supposed to favor projects that produce technologies and raw materials that are on these lists. There's also a call on member states to give a higher weight to security and sustainability criteria when selecting projects in public procurement. So if the projects sort of strengthen domestic production capacity in these critical technologies in the EU, then you are supposed to basically give them preference over projects that do not, even if they are more expensive, but only up to a point, because you cannot force countries to spend a lot of fiscal resources on more expensive procurement unless you give them money to do so, and the EU does not have money to do this. So the second bullet is again sort of aspirational, but it's hard to implement. And the main point then is that member states are allowed to use state aid to promote these critical activities and technologies within certain limits. And here the main sort of big change compared to the existing framework is that if third countries, and by this, the framework means mostly the United States after the Inflation Reduction Act. If third countries attract or try to attract EU industries to their jurisdictions by offering them big money, either as an investment subsidy or as a production subsidy, then member states are authorized by the European Commission to reciprocate. So to offer them, offer the same firms money to stay, but under certain conditions. And the conditions are that more than one member state must be able to benefit from it, or that these projects would in Europe have been important for a structurally weak region. So it is essentially a compromise between saying, you can absolutely have a subsidies race with the United States if you want to, and the view that no, you should not go into a subsidies race, because if you do that, you would be hurting other European countries as well. And so there's an attempt to sort of balance these two things. The fourth point that is important is that unlike the Inflation Reduction Act, none of these European responses openly violate the rules of the World Trade Organization. So in particularly, even though there was pressure among some member states, particularly France, to replicate the America First policy, or to the Buy American policy with a Buy European policy, this did not actually make it into these laws. So there are no local content or assembly requirements for now. Okay, so we basically at Bruegel disagree with most of this. So we agree with some of the objectives, but we do not agree with how it is done. And so these are the main problems with this approach. It is not technology neutral, so it would be better to promote any technology or project that furthers decarbonization and resilience, rather than just going down a list of predefined technologies. However, doing so would require much stronger central governance, right? You would need to, in effect, decide on a discretionary basis whether a project is worth promoting or not. And, discretion can be abused by special interests, and there's politics involved with member states. So you would require very strong EU level governance. This is hard to do. And so this is probably the reason why the NZIA has adopted this list approach, but it has big costs. The second obvious point is that these are very weak instruments. So there is no new EU level funding. You cannot force procurement to rank sustainability or security significantly above cost. And then importantly, the main tool, permitting, may not be a very strong tool for manufacturing. So permitting is very important for energy projects, for extraction, and for transmission lines, because there's a lot of resistance at the local level to having these projects. And so it takes extremely long to actually get them approved. But this is not the case typically for clean industry. Everyone wants to have clean industry. And so to say to member states, you should promote it by accelerating permitting may not give you very much. The third point, which of course we focus on a lot, is that this is an act that is protectionist in spirit, if not in means. So this, like I said, there is no actual discrimination through policy vis-a-vis foreign producers, but the objective, the ultimate objective, is reshoring. So it is import substitution, you know, just like policies in Latin America and, you know, to some extent, East Asia after World War II were about import substitution. So this is a form of import substitution, but with one very big difference, which is that the EU really relies on international trade, particularly on relatively cheap imports for its competitiveness, in, you know, being able to grow and have high productivity inside the EU, but also in being able to then go back into export markets and compete in export markets. And so cutting us off and reshoring activities that may be much cheaper in other countries could damage this competitiveness. The reason, of course, is that we are expensive, right? We're an expensive place to operate, both because of high labor costs, but also because of high energy cost. Because it might increase actually the cost of decarbonization through you know, the substitution away from cheap imports, the strategy in the NZIA could actually slow decarbonization rather than accelerating it. And finally, like I've already said, a strategy that is openly nationalist, so where it's about let's produce as much as possible in the EU, is not a good strategy to promote successful international cooperation. Finally, the member state level subsidies that are now permitted under the state aid framework can harm intra-EU competition at the single market, and this approach generally distracts from reforms that strengthen competitiveness more structurally. Okay, so what is the general alternative that we are proposing here? So it's not to stay with the traditional model that I presented to you in the first slide. So that model clearly cannot deal with some of the challenges that we are facing for the reasons that I explained. Rather, we have to take a view that preserves what is good about the old model, while also recognizing its limitations and addressing them in a more focused way. So that involves selecting policies that do not create conflicts between the big trade-offs that we want to reconcile here. So growth and efficiency on the one hand, this requires, I think, a very open model, a trade-based model. Decarbonization, this requires strengthening to particular technologies and economic security. So one important policy, of course, that does not involve a trade-off between these objectives is just horizontal single market reform. So this is capital markets union, this is strengthening skills, banking union, it's energy policy in the EU. So these are reforms that are good for all industries, but particularly important for clean tech. The second point is that we have a pretty naive definition of economic security underlying these various pieces of legislations, which are based on the current trade patterns. So, you know, how much do we currently rely on China? How much do we currently import from other countries? What is ignored here is our ability to substitute away from these current trade patterns in the face of a shock. This is very hard to measure, but, you know, the experience with the Russia gas cutoff shows that it's actually very important. And so it could be that a product that looks like involves less dependence from China because you're importing less from it actually makes you more dependent because it's harder to substitute away from it if China were to cut off supplies. And it may be that a product that you are importing a lot from China is not so dangerous to import because it would be easy to find substitutes. So this type of analysis is not in the current approach, which really is based on our current so-called strategic dependency, not on the ability to replace it. I generally think that the EU should stay away from economic nationalism because it hurts decarbonization for the reasons I said, growth, and the broader EU foreign policy instrument, unless it is narrowly justified by a security argument, right? So if you like, in this list here of the three arguments why by economic nationalism might be justified in advanced countries, I'm willing to go with three, but not with the other two, including because I don't think that the good jobs externality argument for manufacturing jobs is actually one that you see in the more recent data. The Economist magazine of London wrote a very nice article about this point. And finally, I would go with vertical industrial policy, so to benefit certain technologies. But this industrial policy should be guided by sustainability and resilience objectives rather than specific technologies, so technology neutrality, and it must protect competition in the single market. And this requires a strong EU-level governance and EU-level funding. Because only in this way can you come up with the type of discretionary decision-making backed by serious incentives that actually will succeed. So we have some very specific ideas that I'm not going to go through in detail on how to fix the Net Zero Industry Act to do some of this. And how to complement it. And that involves giving a new push to single market reforms and possibly also creating an agency dedicated to EU-level industrial policy with its own funding. So let me stop here, and I apologize for having gone on too long.